Hey, welcome to my first live stream. Nick Artigo here. I'm going to talk about how to reduce stress and anxiety during stressful times. So, when we're talking about stress, I think it's important to delineate between stressors and the stress response in our bodies. So, stressful events, things that we perceive as threats, are perceived as a negative occurrence. A lot of times there's not much we can do about that. What we can do is change how the body responds. The stress response in the body, whenever it's chronic and consistent, is usually unhealthy. It usually leads to poor thinking and less than optimal decisions. But there's something we can do about it. The most powerful non-drug method of taking the stress response down in the body, of dampening the cortisol response. Cortisol response being what the body does when we're having the stress response. That's so important because cortisol, when it's running too high all of the time, can weaken the immune system. It's definitely important. You don't want to have zero cortisol. That would not be beneficial. You wouldn't be able to get up in the morning without a cortisol spike. It's usually what helps you get up in the morning. But if cortisol is running high all the time, you can get into a state of depletion where some people would call it adrenal fatigue, or the more likely explanation of it is that it's cortisol resistance. If your cortisol is running high all the time, it can lead to a state of chronic fatigue. So, how do you take that cortisol level down? The most powerful way that we have is through control of the breathing. So, a lot of people, if I'm standing in front of a crowd and I say, take a deep breath, what most people do is they take this massive chest and thoracic and clavicular breath. And you can see what happened there is I expanded the rib cage and I lifted the clavicles and my abdomen came in. That's not a deep breath. That's a big breath, but it's a shallow breath, because when the rib cage expands and the belly comes in, I'm not pulling the air into the lower parts of the lungs where gas exchange can happen more readily. So a deep breath is not necessarily the biggest breath you can take. Deep breath is where you inhale and the rib cage and the collarbones remain pretty still, but the abdomen, the lower abdomen, expands like that. So on the inhale, the lower abdomen should be expanding, and on the exhale, it should be coming back in. And the abdomen is expanding in all directions, front and side. So that's the first aspect of taking a nice deep breath. Slowing down the breath is key to dampening the stress response. And the best way to slow down the breath, the aspect of the breath where you can control and have the most acute control over the breath and have the most effective change in your breathing pattern, is the exhalation. So if you want to slow your breathing down, don't try to breathe more air in at the end of the inhale. the best, most effective way is to empty a little bit more air out at the end of the exhale. And that looks kind of like this. There's a breath in, and then the exhale is coming out. And then at the end, just let a little more out. The abdomen will come in. If you can gradually slow down your exhalations, each breath, meaning each successive exhalation, you let it last a little bit longer, you're going to slow down your breathing and you're going to shift your body over time away from the stress response. When the stress response is in high gear, it takes brain activity away from the parts of the brain that we use for executive function and better decision making. When the stress response is kicked up, it's kind of like survival mode, and it ramps up the more primitive, reactive parts of the brain, what some people would call the reptilian brain. And that's perfectly good response. We need that response sometimes. We need that response in any situation where running away or fighting is necessary or helpful or beneficial. But if you ever find yourself in a situation where running away or fighting is not helpful or beneficial, and you feel the stress response, heart rate's going up, muscle tension's going up, that response is not helping you in any way. It's not helping you think more clearly. It's actually taking away from your capacity to think rationally, reasonably, and clearly. When you notice that happening, the thing to do is breathe through your nose. When you're breathing through the nose, it's a smaller opening, so it's going to slow down the breath. And each exhale, try to let it lengthen out a little bit. If you can let your exhales last 7 seconds or longer, you're going to shift your physiological response away from the stress response and into the relaxation response, where you'll have a clear head and be able to make the best decisions possible. There are a lot of breathing methods you could use. There are methods where you count the inhale and you count the exhale. You do a second count. So for example, box breathing would be a method where you inhale for a 4 count, pause for a 4 count, exhale for a 4 count, and pause for a 4 count. You repeat that cycle. That'll slow down your breathing. Another method that's useful is inhaling for a 4 count, having a 7 count pause, and an 8 count exhale, and repeating that cycle. But all you really need to do is slow down the exhales and slow down your breathing. Another aspect of better breathing is not to think of moving more air. It's actually about moving only the amount of air necessary to function. Because if you hyperventilate, you're going to bring your CO2 levels down. So if I take big, slow breaths, let's say I'm doing a 4 count box breathing, and my breaths are really big, bigger than they need to be, and I'm moving more air than necessary, I'm taking the CO2 level in my blood down. And if I do that habitually, I'm going to become accustomed to a low CO2 level, and I'm going to need to overbreathe in order to keep my CO2 levels low. Rising CO2 in the blood is the main trigger that gives you the urge to breathe in your respiratory center in your brain. You want to get a high CO2 tolerance so that you can operate while the CO2 is rising in your blood and not feel that strong urge to breathe more, to take the CO2 level down. The urge we get to breathe when we hold our breath has nothing to do with lack of oxygen. It has everything to do with a rise in CO2. So you want to be able to handle a rise in CO2 without feeling a strong urge to breathe more. Because the more you can get your CO2 level elevated, the more effectively and efficiently oxygen transfer will happen between the blood and your brain and muscles. So the more you can get accustomed to having a high CO2 level, which means you only breathe the amount of volume necessary, barely the amount of volume necessary. Better breathing is not bigger breathing. Better breathing is not breathing more air in and out per minute. Better breathing is breathing only the amount of air that you need to deliver oxygen. And the higher you can let your CO2 level rise and be comfortable with it, the more effectively oxygen is going to dissociate from the hemoglobin molecule on your red blood cells and get into your muscles and into your brain cells, where it can do what it's needed to do in your body. And that's another big key in controlling your stress level with your breathing. Practicing very slight breathing, meaning if I'm at rest, my breath should be so slight and subtle that it's barely noticeable by someone that's watching. A good way you can practice that is to tune into the sensation of the air moving in and out of your nose while you're breathing. And try to let the sensation of the air moving in and out of your nose be so slight and subtle that you have to really try to notice it. Practicing that as often as possible will shift your breathing to the point where you're doing it the most effectively and efficiently. You keep it in as slow as you can get it, but still delivering the oxygen that you need to run your body's operations. But not so slight that you go low on oxygen. And that really is a key. And that is probably the most overlooked aspect of better breathing. Many people who are into the breath work try to move a lot of air. And there are methods that you use, like the Wim Hof breathing method and breath of fire from yoga. But those are not meant to be your all the time chronic breathing pattern. Those are meant to trigger your body to have a stress response in order to make it stronger. So when you're doing a Wim Hof breathing method or breath of fire, which is kind of like the Wim Hof breathing method is huge inhales. And the breath of fire is powerful pulsatile exhales. Those breathing methods have their place, but what they're designed to do is take your CO2 level down. So oxygen delivery to the tissues is actually less effective. And that short-term stressor makes your body more resilient. But you don't want to be breathing like that all the time. The best breathing pattern most optimal breathing pattern is not to move the most air. The only time that's the most effective pattern is when you're in an all-out sprint and CO2 is building up so fast that you just need to get it out. And there are methods like that that you can use during high-intensity exercise. During low-intensity cardio and during your resting periods, you definitely want to breathe as much as necessary, but only as much as necessary. So in summary, keys to reducing stress with your breathing. Breathe through the nose. Allow your breath to be as slow as you can make it. Control your breathing pattern by controlling the exhalations. So make your breathing pattern as slow as you can by letting your exhalations last a little longer. Also, and this is probably the most overlooked one, is to breathe only the amount of air necessary. Meaning you're playing with that edge where you feel like you want to breathe a little bit more, but not breathing more. Letting your CO2 levels rise as much as tolerable, allowing oxygen transfer to happen much better between your blood and your working cells, particularly the brain and your muscle cells. So give that a try. Let me know if you have any questions or comments below, and let me know if you'd like more live streams. Thank you.